name's Fraser Broadfoot, and I'm the head of antibiotic sales, use and stewardship within the antimicrobial resistance department at the BMD. So the purpose of this talk is to provide a practical, step-by-step approach for collecting and the reporting of antibiotic sales and antibiotic use data. So my first recommendation is to consider what are your main objectives for collecting this data, and this includes both antibiotic sales data as well as antibiotic usage data. So, for example, is the idea just to monitor trends or the effects of control measures? And we know this is useful because a lot of countries and sectors are putting in place measures to reduce inappropriate antibiotic use, and so having a national figure to monitor the trends can be really important. Is the main aim to actually understand risk factors? So it may be that there is higher usage within certain sectors than others, or maybe higher usage of these highest priority critical antibiotics. So that's something you need to consider in advance if that's something that you really want to look at. Certainly the antibiotic use data has been very useful in many countries, and in the UK we've seen this for setting targets. So if you have antibiotic use data split by sector, then the sectors can actually develop targets and aspirations and say we aim to get to this level by this time, and that can really help to drive some of these improvements. But you can also have targets based on sales data and on national sales data, so if that's something that you want, then that's something that's worth considering in advance. Do you want to your data to go into some international reports, in which case maybe consider the metric, maybe are you collecting data that's comparable with the other data that's being included within those international reports? And one of the ones I'm thinking of there is the Animuse spreadsheet, which has data from multiple different countries. Are you wanting to link the antibiotic sales or use data with resistance data? So we find that this is a very useful thing to do. Firstly, you can potentially demonstrate that if you're seeing reduced sales or use, then you can link that to see if that's resulting in reductions in antibiotic resistance, which is ultimately the key purpose of improving antibiotic use, is to reduce the likelihood of resistance developing. Secondly, also it's important for the sectors to understand, because sometimes you can get these resistances of concern come up, and then the first question is always commonly, is this related to use in animals? And so you can have a look at which antibiotics are being used and how they're being used, and that can give you an idea as to what could be the potential cause of this resistance that's developed. Farm benchmarking, I'll touch on this within this presentation, but that basically means the comparison of antibiotic use from one farm to another similar farm type, maybe nationally or maybe regionally, and this can really help with we've found that this can really help with the vet-farmer conversation around improving antibiotic use on that particular farm. People often think that what they're doing is responsible, but once they see data, then this helps to kind of inform the actual evidence-based conversation. One of your aims may be to understand reason for treatment, so not just how much antibiotics being used, but also why the antibiotics are being used and for what reason. So that might be something you're interested in. And then also potentially for trade reasons. So it can be collecting this data. It can be a good way of demonstrating to your international trade partners that you are responsible and you can be trusted. But I would say that there's lots of potential reasons why you want to be collecting this data, but there is always a balance between what you would ideally like, what is nice to have, and what is feasible based on the resources you have available. So I wouldn't overcomplicate things at the start. It's better to collect some simple data than to not collect data at all. So my second recommendation would be to start with antibiotic sales data rather than going straight for the antibiotic use data. So the main difference between antibiotic sales data and antibiotic use data is that sales data is earlier in the chain, and it usually represents what's been sold for use, sold for use in animals, but it cannot be split by species or sector. We were collecting antibiotic sales data. In the UK, we started collecting this in 1993, and it wasn't until 2012 that we started to publish some antibiotic use data. So I think it's a really good starting place. It's definitely less resource intensive than collecting antibiotic use data. It does have limitations, for example, in the sense that one key one is that with sales data you cannot split by species or sector, but it's still a really informative thing to monitor. And in some cases you can certainly use it to monitor overall trends. It may give you a broad indication of use per species. So there are some products that are authorised only for one species, and also there's a lot of products that are maybe licensed for two species. So in the UK we have a lot of products that were licensed for pigs and poultry. So the early sales data that we collected did demonstrate that the highest use was within products that were authorised for pigs and poultry. We couldn't tell whether it was pigs or poultry, we couldn't split it, but even having that knowledge does help from an understanding risk perspective. So you can get sales data from multiple different places depending on the country. So you might want to look at what antibiotics are imported into your country. You may also want to look at what antibiotics are manufactured if you have pharmaceutical manufacturing in your country. And in that case, you would then have to take off how much has been exported if some products are manufactured but then used elsewhere. So, how much is imported plus how much is manufactured minus how much is exported could be a way to go to understand how much has actually been sold for use. In the UK, we get the data from the marketing authorization holders. So these are the people who hold licenses for marketing particular antibiotics in the UK. And so this largely represents what they sell out to the veterinary wholesalers, who then sell to the vets, who then prescribe to the farmers. Drug sponsors are another potential source, as well as wholesalers. So it's the wholesalers who buy from the drug sponsors or the marketing authorization holders and then sell onto the prescribers. So collecting data from wholesalers also represents antibiotic sales data. So really there's lots of potential sources, and it's best just to consider what's the most appropriate within your country. There may still be gaps in coverage, so you may not capture everything, but you need to try and work out what is the best source to capture the best data that you can. So for example, our data from the marketing authorization holders doesn't include any products that have come in under something called the special import scheme, for example. So that there are often gaps, and it's important to understand that. So this is what I said, the key consideration is what is the coverage of the data that you're collecting. So does it represent everything that's used, or does it only represent a subset of what is used? So for example, depending on the country, you might have an authorized route, but there might be some people who are using an unauthorized route, and so it's always useful to understand what percentage coverage do you think you have, but still carry on and collect this data, but it's just useful to understand the limitations. In terms of the basic data that you normally collect for antibiotic sales in order to determine the volume of antibiotics sold, the basic data is usually the volume data. So the number of kilograms of a product that have been sold, the number of litres of a product, or in some cases the number of bottles or tubes of a product that have been sold. And then you multiply that, as long as you know the what active ingredients are within that product, and you also know the strength within that product, so things like the milligram of active per litre or the grams of active per kilogram. If you know that, then you can just multiply those two things together, and that can give you the total amount of active ingredient that has been sold. So step 2, as well as collecting the numerator data, so the amount of active ingredient data, it's also very, very helpful to collect some animal number data, because most of the metrics, as I'll talk later, combine both an amount of something that represents what is prescribed, as well as something that represents the overall animal population in that country. And that's because what you're really interested in is relative antibiotic use. So, antibiotic use relative to the animals that are reared. For example, especially if you're comparing countries, then some countries are much bigger than other countries. But what's important is how much antibiotics being used relative to the number of animals that are actually being reared. Ideally, if the sales data that you collect covers the whole country, that would be ideal, and then you can potentially use your national statistics. So what data have you got available nationally? Maybe you've got some survey data which tells you the number of living animals, maybe like the number of dairy cows, something like that. But you may also have some slaughter statistics, and these can be a really useful way of determining how many animals are reared in the country as well. If you only have a partial data set, then you would need to try and, if for example, if the sales data only covers a certain region, then you would maybe need to get regional data or actually get animal number data from the farms where you're getting the sales data from. Ideally, I would align with the WOA methodology. So WOA have developed a standardized methodology where they have where they collect certain animal data and they multiply it by standardized weights. So I think it's useful to align with standard methodologies, because then the figure that you produce can be compared with the kind of national or regional figure. However, having said that, if you cannot get the animal number data, you cannot get the denominator data, then still collect the volume data. It's still useful to report volume of active ingredients, for example, in tons of active ingredient. That's still a useful thing to monitor, and you can still use that to monitor trends. So if you can't get the animal number data, I'd still collect the sales data. Okay, so then step 3, once you've got the numerator bit and you've got the denominator bit, the animal number data bit, then you can think about how am I actually going to calculate this sales data. So what metric am I going to use? So one of the commonly used metrics, and we use this in the UK for food animals, is and it's also used across the EU, and it's used by WOA, is the milligrams per kilogram. So that's milligrams of active ingredient compared with the kilograms of animals. And what usually happens is you collect either the number of living animals or the number of slaughtered animals, and then you multiply this by a standardized weight to give you the total weight of animals within the region or the country. So the WOA publishers have got some methodology for calculating these weights. Often the weights are based on the average living weight of that animal or the average weight at slaughter. But it's good it'd be good to choose weights that are standardized for your country. The other thing that you need to do is determine a time period for the sales data. So commonly for national reporting, this sales data is annually, is the most common one used, but you could do it more frequently than that if you wanted to. The next step is how, once you've got those figures, once you've got these milligram per kilogram or tonnage or whatever metric you want to use, the next thing is how you're going to actually report the data. So a common thing that's done are national reports, so maybe a national country report. This is what we do in the UK. We have a publication called the UK VARS report that contains our antibiotic sales data, as well as our antibiotic use data and resistance data. But these can be really useful. One of the things I would say is that we also publish alongside our big report, we also publish some relatively simple infographics and graphs, which are just kind of 3 pages of the real key messages and simple messages. And what we've found is that I think overall people often look at this more than they look at the main report, because it's more accessible for busy vets and for busy farmers who are often interested in the data but maybe time poor. So I definitely recommend keeping things simple, keeping things visual, so that as many people can read it. And you still keep the scientific report for people who want the detail. The other thing is you could potentially even adapt it to the stakeholders. So you could produce a farmer report, which uses information that the farmers might find interesting, and then you could also maybe have a report that's more tailored towards the prescribers. So you could even consider doing multiple reports. And then you also need to consider what are you actually going to include within your report. So you may just include the milligram per kilogram figure. You may split it by active ingredient. You may split it by reason for treatment. That's can often be a useful thing to monitor. You may also split it by whether the use of these highest priority critically important antibiotics for human use. So these are the really last resort antibiotics that for human medicine. And it's important to monitor these separately, because these are the ones where there's often a big focus to only use them when absolutely appropriate, when there aren't any other antibiotic classes that are likely to be clinically effective. And for this, we would often follow the WHO medically important antimicrobial listing, which classifies these HPCAs, including the likes of these 3rd and 4th generation cephalosporins, the fluoroquinolones and quinolones, and the polymyxins. So these are the ones that we really are focusing on only using when absolutely necessary. But yeah, basics, start simple, maybe simple infographics, simple graphs, is my main thing, is my main recommendation, because then more people will actually get that messaging. and maybe even consider doing videos or podcasts, or there's obviously multiple ways in which you can get the messaging out there. Once you've got the antibiotic sales data, then I think it is useful to consider whether you want to collect antibiotic use data. So the antibiotic use data is the main difference between use and sales, as I mentioned before, is that it's closer to where the antibiotics are used, and it can be split by species or by sector. So that's one of the real keys. The two main ways in which you can get this data is either from the vets. So that represents, this is kind of step 2 actually, is where you're going to get the data from. So often you will get the data either from the vets or from the prescribers using prescription records. That's where in the UK we get the vast majority of the antibiotic use data. Potentially you could also get the data from farms as well. What we've found is that we know that the vets do have very accurate records, and we found that this is a less resource intensive way of getting antibiotic use data. There are potential disadvantages. For example, just because something's been prescribed for use on a farm doesn't mean it's actually used within that particular time frame. And also, farm records may be, with the prescriber records, sometimes it's not so easy to split by species. So, for example, a product may be prescribed for a farm, but the vet might not necessarily know how much ends up getting used, for example, in a sheep as opposed to a cow, if you have a farm that has multiple species on it. Sometimes we also find that in the UK, some of the farm records are written down in medicine books, and actually extracting that data is quite time-consuming and can be difficult, whereas most vet records are electronic, which makes extracting that data more straightforward. The other thing you need to consider is, are you trying to get data from all farms within a country or within a region, or are you wanting to get a sample, a representative sample? So clearly, only getting the data from a sample of farms is generally less resource intensive than getting it from all farms. But one of the challenges is how to ensure that it's a representative sample. So sometimes the farms that are willing to share the data may be some of the more progressive farms, and they may not be representative of overall use. But whichever method you use, I think it's useful to carry out a pilot, try it on a few farms first, see what works well before expanding it out to all the farms. So overall, when consider antibiotic use data, here are the different factors to consider. So what data is readily available? So is it just that you can get volume data, or is there some more detailed data that you might be able to get, which I'll talk about next? What's the coverage of the use data? Are you trying to get every single farm? Are you just trying to get a small number of farms? Even if you're trying to get every farm, you may find that it's difficult, so you may end up getting data that's not full coverage, and so in that case you need to collect the animal number data from the farms that are supplying the data in order to understand what is the overall coverage of the data that you're collecting. And then also the level of detail, and that goes back to what is your main purpose for doing this in the first place. So if you just want to know a simple weight-based mg per kg metric, then the main thing you need to know is the volume of products that are sold, maybe in kilograms and litres or in packs, and then you can multiply that by the strength and the active ingredients within each pack. You may also want to go a bit more detailed, so you may want to collect data on age of treatment. That can be a useful thing to understand from a stewardship perspective. So are the treatments in the younger animals, that's often the case, or are they in some of the older animals? Collecting dose rates can be a useful thing to understand if the correct dose rates are being used. There are some systems involve collecting the number of animals treated and the number of days in which these animals are treated. So in the UK, the laying hen sector have a very detailed data collection system, so they know how many days each animal is treated with an antibiotic, and then they can actually do a percentage figure, so percentage bird days, the number of days that each bird is treated versus the number of days that the birds are on that farm for that particular time period. And also, indication for treatment is a useful thing to monitor, because it means that sectors and particular sectors can understand not just how much antibiotics are being used, but why the antibiotics are being used. And looking at indication for treatment can really help with sectors to introduce stewardship activities, may be focused on a particular indication that's responsible for a higher level of antibiotic use. So step 3, this is similar to the antibiotic sales data. As well as getting the amount of a numerator figure, you do also need to collect a denominator, which is the animal number part. So this, you know, if you have a full national coverage, then you may be able to just use the national figures. Otherwise, you will need to collect the animal number data from the farm. So you need to determine in advance what animal number data you need in order to do the calculation that you want to do. So as I mentioned before, aligning with the WOA methodology is useful where possible, because that is a standardized metric. Having said that, the WOA methodology is more being designed for national monitoring, and so you may find that it doesn't work so well for benchmarking in your country. So you may need to develop a country-specific benchmarking methodology. If there is no denominator, then you can still report tons of active ingredients. So I would still, even if you can't get the animal number data, still collect the active ingredient data, still publish that data, because it's useful for monitoring trends and also understanding which antibiotics are being used, which routes of administration are being used, and that can inform stewardship activities. So step 4, once the next thing, as with the sales data, is once you've got the data, or this probably should be determined in advance, but what is the most appropriate metric? So what are you going to report in your maybe benchmark report or in your national reports? So one of the commonly used metrics is milligrams of active ingredient per kilogram of animals within that species or sector, and that's a very commonly used metric. There are some limitations, and so there are some sectors. Species are working with actual different types of metrics. So one of them is a count-based metric, as I mentioned before, for example, number of days in which an animals are at a farm compared to the number of what they call animal places, which is the number of days overall that there are animals on the farm, can be a useful metric. And also what you can do is you can use your, if you know the amount of active ingredient used for individual products, then you can look at the average dose rates that are given for that particular species or sector, and then you can estimate the number of days in which the animals are under antibiotics by using these standard dose rates. So that can be a useful thing. That's called daily dose, the daily dose rates. Again, you need to determine the time period, and you need to determine whether your focus is just national reporting, just put out an overall figure for that species or sector, or whether you also want to do some farm level benchmarking. And then step 5 is to work out reporting of that data. So we publish our usage data annually within the UK VARS report, as I mentioned before. But for example, in the pig sector, within their industry-run system, which is called E&B Pigs, there is benchmarking. So every farm can log on to this system and they can see their antibiotic use relative to the average antibiotic use for that particular pig farm in the country. So if that's something you want to do, then you need to work out how are you going to do this. It could be via an online system, or it could be via a report that you print out or that you email and send to that particular farm. Again, you can adapt the reports to the stakeholders, as I've mentioned before, and you need to try and work out what is the main thing that you're focusing on. Is it just the total amount used? Do you want to split it by route of administration, by highest priority critically important antibiotics? And as with the sales data, the more graphical you can make it, you do infographics, graphs, podcasts, webinars, etc. Any things like that can maybe help to get the message out rather than just providing a large kind of scientific report. So let's just consider a few other points that I haven't talked about yet. One point is how are you going to collect the data? So you've probably seen some electronic systems, and these are great. I think the advantage of electronic systems is that, for example, vets or farmers can submit their data electronically. There can be, I'll talk about it later, but you put in these kind of automatic validation steps. It's relative. Once something that's electronic, it's quite easy to then do some of the calculations potentially automatically. And that's what we have currently for our sales data in the UK, and also some of the use data. For example, in the pig sector, there's a system called EMB Pigs that I've mentioned already, and that is an electronic system where farmers, vets usually add the data and then farmers submit the data every 3 months. However, you don't need a complicated, expensive electronic system. Manual systems can work well through simple Excel spreadsheets, and that's how we started with our antibiotic sales data, is using an Excel spreadsheet-based approach, and that is still how some of the sectors in the UK do collect their antibiotic use data. So they have the industry bodies ask each of the main farm businesses to collate their antibiotic use data via a spreadsheet. That gets shared to the industry body, who then collate all the spreadsheet data together, and then they share it with us. So yeah, you don't need a complex electronic system to start with. A spreadsheet-based system can still work really, really well. The other key thing to consider in advance is how the data is going to be validated. So data quality is a really, really important area, and it is quite a resource-intensive area to ensure data quality, because mistakes happen, and it's relatively common for vets and farmers to submit inaccurate data, and it's very important, if that does happen, that it's picked up on. So, for example, if there are particularly high outliers or a very big change from one quarter or 1 year to the next year, then this is something that should be picked up on and double checked. So the automatic systems do have the advantage in that they can do this, potentially do this more automatically. Another way of data validation is maybe having a two-step process. So this could be that the data is provided by the vet, but then the farmer has to validate and submit that data. Or it could be the other way around, that the data is provided by the farmer and then the vet has to validate and submit that data. Or there could be an industry body involved, that is, whoever submits the data, there is a separate industry body who is checking these figures and looking for anomalies or potential inaccuracies. Another very important issue is data ownership, and sometimes vets and farmers might be very nervous about sharing the data, and it does need to be clear who owns the data, and once it's shared, what's going to be done with the data. So in the UK, our usual remit is that the farmer ultimately owns the data of antibody use on their farm, so they need to give relative permission. They need to get permissions in order for that data to be shared. Some sectors get around this by actually anonymizing, so having anonymity. So, and in the UK, we never know how much antibodies are used in a particular farm. It's always collated by the sector bodies, and then they anonymize it, and then they share it with us. And we find that approach works, because generally the farms and the vets are happy to share it with a trusted industry body, and they're happier that the government only receives anonymous aggregated data rather than actually knowing data for individual farms, because there's fear about how this data is going to be used. But either way, it's very important to collaborate with the vets, the farmers, or the prescribers, and make sure people really understand how the data is going to be used, and therefore they'll be more confident to give development permissions, and they'll be more comfortable with sharing data generally. The other thing to talk about is benchmarking. It's very important that you are only comparing like-for-like farms. So, for example, often it's the farms with the younger animals. So in the pig sector, maybe the farms that have the weaners that are going to have higher antibiotic use compared to maybe a finisher farm or a breeder farm, which don't have the higher risk animals in them. So therefore, if you're comparing antibiotic use, you need to compare like-for-like farms. And the other thing that's important to consider in advance is, what are you going to do with the benchmarking data? So is it literally just to inform the vet-farmer conversation or the prescriber-farmer conversation? That's fine. Or potentially, are you going to be adding thresholds? Are there going to be outcomes if someone goes over a particular level, for example? And in the UK, there's currently a persistent high user scheme for the pig sector, where any farms that are in the top 5% by farm type, they do have to come up with, they have to work with their vet and come up with an antibiotic plan that's looking into how they can bring their antibiotic use down. So they are the key points. I'll just to run through them as a summary. So the first recommendation was to consider your main objectives for collecting this data. This refers to both antibiotic sales data and antibiotic use data. So I would start with antibiotic use data. That's usually less resource intensive, but can still be extremely useful. And so the steps are written out there. You need to work out what's the data source, the best data source in your country. What animal number data have you got available within your country that you can use to alongside the sales data that you collect, and then using that data, what is the metric that you're going to report? What is the most appropriate metric that you're going to use, and how are you going to then report that data? Then the third recommendation is to consider antibiotic use data. So this involves determining what data you're after, the best data source, again, similar to sales, the best denominator, what's the most appropriate metric, and again, how are you actually going to report this data? So, and I would recommend, as I mentioned before, some of the graphical ways, infographics, simple graphs, something that that more people are going to actually look at and understand. So other considerations, which I touched on at the end, it's important to write a plan that includes a number of things. So who is actually, what's the governance? So who is funding the system? Who is in control of it? What are the roles and responsibilities of the individuals that are collating the data and looking into the quality control? How is the data going to be collected? Who is collecting the data? Who is validating the data? Data ownership, data sharing. These are all really, really important issues that you need to work out in advance, as well as benchmarking. Are you going to do it? How are you going to do it? And what is the consequence of being within a particular level relative to the other farms? So I wanted to include a reference to these acting guidelines. So this was the acting was a group that came together to provide some guidelines on setting up an antibiotic use data collection system, and I think that they produced some really useful and practical guidelines, which I think are worth to read. So that's link there to the acting guidelines. And then I've got another couple of references up here as well. Firstly, this was so TAPFAR, which is the Transatlantic Task Force for AMR, did produce a document that looks into the reporting of sales and use of antimicrobials across the UK, the EU, Norway, as well as the USA and Canada. So this is a really, really useful report that explains how sales and use is collected in these different areas, different countries and regions, and it looks into detail on the different metrics that are used and some of the methodology as well. So I think it's well worth a look. And then I've got another link, which is a link to a website that explains which benchmarking metrics we actually use in the